at a time when our own, when our own labors are just really especially straining. I've been going to LAWCHA for years, despite not being trained as a historian, though trained by historians who are here tonight. And I've always been really grateful that you let me be an interloper. So I'm really happy to be able to talk to you tonight about my book. LAWCHA is also responsible for my favorite answer to the "what's the weirdest" question you've gotten after a paper question. And I might tell you what it is after the talk. So I'm going to start today where the story starts. After we talked about wages, connecting with scene partners, policy, and how porn performance is a lot like working in a bookstore, Connor Habib paused to trouble the work language I was using. "I don't like the worker part," Habib told me. "I'll use porn star, that's fine. I like being a constellation instead of a laborer." After that interview, I started to ask interviewees if porn worker resonated with them. "I absolutely am a porn worker," Ella Darling responded. "I respect it if someone doesn't want to think of this as work, but it is. You can think of it as dancing on the moon. That doesn't change the fact that this is how you pay your bills." What's a labor scholar to do with this tension? How to do labor ethnography at the intersection of porn work as work and porn work as anti-work. And for our purposes today, how to think about labor and working class history for a community that hasn't agreed that what they're doing is laboring, and who do everything they can to exit from the working class. That is, one defined by its subordinate relationship to the means of production. We'll get back there. More broadly, my book tries to think through workers' interventions into their jobs, how they think about the politics of authenticity and identity, and the question of what we should do with and about the state. Today, I'm going to talk about what porn workers' struggles within and against work, to borrow from Kathy Weeks, might offer scholarship and activism around straight work. That's what sex workers call jobs outside the sex industry. Today's talk, like my book, is grounded in 81 interviews, fieldwork, set visits, and conversations really with folks in the US porn industry. I'm going to focus on the connections and disconnections among porn workers and others' struggle for labor justice, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have that are more specific to the industry. So why listen to porn workers specifically? I want to argue that porn workers reveal deep contradictions at the core of late capitalism. Workers exit traditional jobs in search of autonomy, but find precarity on the other side. Pleasure makes work livable, but it also gets us to do more of it. The authenticity we seek in sex and work can be sold off for parts, and it can also be sustaining. Workers organize against the twin forces of state surveillance and neglect. And solidarities break down when workers escape managerial control by becoming managers themselves. These tensions are, of course, familiar to scholars and activists around straight work too. I'm going to argue today that the left should be paying attention to how porn workers theorize and navigate them. That's to say, this isn't just a bid for inclusion, but instead that laboring on the margins of respectability gives porn workers a sharper lens. There are a few things I want to pull out here. One is the sense of historical memory. Precarity isn't new here. And I think this changes the terms of how we talk about the gig and the crisis of gigification. It's also a community that's resolutely against nostalgia. There's no longing here for a return to the factory or the cubicle farm. You'll also find an unromantic view of work. Even workers who don't claim anti-capitalist politics talk about producers as, quote, making money off them in ways you just don't hear from most academics, for example. Relations of extraction are maybe less concealed here, but workers also spend a lot of time thinking about exploitation because outsiders, straight workers, are fixated on porn as a special side of it. It's also a community that's largely against claims to the dignity of work. So some porn workers organize around the social usefulness of their work, but I'm most interested in those who avoid those claims. Porn's social value is that it's a job for people who can't or don't want to do straight jobs. And finally, it's a community that's largely against the politics of inclusion. The sex worker thinkers I'm most invigorated by know that inclusion isn't on offer. And so they're less surprised when its promises fail us, when employers don't hold up their end of the bargain, or when the state fails to protect. It might be better to begin with the perspective, as the sex worker activist collective Hacking Hustling puts it, that, quote, any system can be hacked, any system can be hustled. Porn workers are especially creative about those hacks, making use of the resources on offer. As many managers complain to me, porn workers find hacks and workarounds at every turn. We'll return there too, but first I want to take a step back and think about how porn workers come to this position in the first place. It's because we can't tell stories about sex work without thinking about the jobs workers left behind. My degree in art was taking me nowhere, said Anna Fox. After a few promotions, she was managing a grocery store, but, quote, still barely making enough to live. When she found out that porn would pay in one day what the grocery store did in a month, she thought, why would I go back? A month later, she quit the grocery store. I was just like, fuck overtime, she remembered thinking. I'd rather be on overtime humping a hot dude or chick. The stress of this is way easier to trade over a 9 to 5. There, she dealt with long hours, low pay, and grinding anti-Black racism. Fuck overtime. Straight jobs meant economic insecurity for many of the porn workers who left them, but they also consumed too much of life. Others left nursing, investment banking, teaching. It's maybe an early version of the Great Resignation. And this has historically always been true. Sex workers have always pursued sexual labor, not just as an economic survival strategy, but also as a way to refuse more extractive and less pleasurable ways of working and living. This is maybe sticky for our purposes today too. How to build solidarities with civilian, that is, non-sex working workers, when so much sex worker discourse suggests that you'd have to be doing bad math to put up with what they do. It also ties into gig work discourse now. Uber is a bad boss, but what are people living behind? What are their material motivations? What forms of autonomy are they seeking and sometimes finding? I think the case of porn work reminds us that gig workers aren't stupid or duped. And still, porn work is work and its conditions are often bad ones. Every porn scene is a record of people at work. If porn workers seek out porn for a departure from the harms of straight work, they often find them reproduced on the set. One director, performer, representatively told me that he determines rates this way. What is the lowest rate I can pay people where I'd still get them to shoot for me? Workers find extreme racist pay differentials, differentials in on-set treatment, and racist representational norms. Management has no incentive to ensure safe working conditions because workers pay all the costs if they get sick or injured at work. There's a lot to say here about porn as a vanguard for the conditions straight workers eventually come to, as we see in the pandemic now. There's also the question of tedium. Porn work is boring more than it is spectacularly injurious or uniquely fun. Workers find the mundanities of workplace harassment and bosses who require you to act like their friend. Also, workplace cultures that expect a performance of loving the job and being there not just for the money. This is intensified by management's and ethical consumers' demands for porn consumption that makes them feel better about paying for sexual labor. So workers have to do the work of filming a scene and then the additional labor of pretending they're not working at all. That's to say that the things many porn performers find most draining about porn are rarely what outsiders assume. It's torn ligaments, not child trafficking. Clingy co-stars, not being tricked into performances you didn't agree to do. On one set I visited, a first-time performer showed far too much interest in his more experienced partner, pestering her during downtimes and wanting to cuddle and kiss after the cameras had stopped rolling. She just wanted to go home, she told me later. It wasn't that the sex had been particularly bad. It was just that her rescue dog didn't like being left home alone. I'm always interested in how disappointed some progressives are when I tell stories like this, as if they're hoping that the stories of sensational violence are all true. And this is to say that even if porn is sometimes a way to refuse other work, it also feels very much like work. This is why, once in porn, many performers do everything they can to avoid working for other people. And that is, in some ways, to leave the working class. Performers with less social and economic capital rely most on creative arrangements such as trade shoots and producing their own low-budget scenes. Workers who encounter the poorest treatment when they work under a boss are quickest to try to escape those hierarchies. Racialized performers, for example, often self-produce as a way to circumvent racist good old boy producers and agents. Trans performers are quick to self-produce so that they might avoid the fetishizing norms of the trans genre. When I talk about worker managers as a hybrid class category, then I'm not just talking about a labor aristocracy. And still, taking on managerial roles often means subjecting other workers to the very conditions you'd hope to escape. Porn's class story is particularly messy because class boundaries are less calcified here. They're even less so thanks to digitization and the explosion of platforms like OnlyFans, which let performers produce and distribute their own content. Performer Samantha Grace explained, "You have to do other things to make money. Film work is a form of marketing. I work with other companies so I can promote my own website, my own films, my own custom videos, and pro-doming." Grace's description of how she came to work in the industry. She chose sex work as an alternative to low-wage retail jobs that left her thinking, "Oh my God, I'm never going to get out of this." Helps contextualize her approach. Retail work meant being trapped, and sex work entrepreneurship promised an alternative. She refused to limit herself to the kinds of sex work that, in making money for someone else, felt most like retail. Porn workers have a keen understanding of the relations of ownership. They work for others strategically so they can promote their own websites, custom videos, products, and services. And this might shift to how we talk about the scene as a site of exploitation. It's a strategy, though, that is intensely vulnerable to platforms' ever-changing terms of service agreements, to their extractive payment structures, and to payment processors' discriminatory policy, and to the constant onslaught of anti-sex worker law, such as FOSTA SESTA, and recent struggles over payment processing on sites like OnlyFans. These are policies sold as ways to protect trafficking victims, but they make it harder to work independently. They solder workers to their managers. But when the strategy to self-produce does work, it can mean real autonomy for workers some of the time. This places them in liminal space in relationship to the regulatory state and also to scholarship and activism. Prevailing assumptions about porn as a contest between powerful managers and vulnerable workers break down. Porn workers are very rarely only workers. Instead, they occupy constantly shifting class positions as entrepreneurs, independent contractors, formal and recognized employees, contracted and freelance managers, and producers. This shapes and reshapes and makes a mess of their class perspectives in countless ways. But it's also not something to be fixed if we're trying to do a labor history that is accountable to the working people at the core. It's also a dynamic that pisses managers off, which I think is a sign that it's a good thing. In 2018, years into the web-facilitated erosion of porn's class hierarchy, a director complained online about performers' use of time on set to distribute content to fans on OnlyFans and premium Snapchat. These are services that allow fans to purchase access to performers' self-produced photos and videos. If you're going to use my set as a personal studio and probably make more money than I do, maybe I should at least get a discount or leave your phone in your fucking car, he said. He added, I've been doing this over 25 years and I have a $16,000 camera, but some girl with an iPhone is probably making more money than me. We really can think about this explosion as a crisis for labor history, but also as a crisis for management. And again, I want to think about it in the context of gig economies more broadly, where it might reveal not just the growing power of platform capitalism, but also the class struggle at work in this history. But again, if this is a problem for management, it's also a problem for the labor movement and for Marxists. What to do with workers who don't want to be and often aren't just workers. To put a fine point on it, most porn workers would rather have no boss than one disciplined by the state or even collective bargaining. Prevailing discourse on the labor left would view this as prototypical of a kind of neoliberal entrepreneurship and assume a dynamic that makes broad-based solidarity impossible, competition cutthroat, and working class identity elusive. But none of that holds exactly in the porn work context. Instead, porn workers develop sophisticated networks of mutual aid, share trade secrets with each other readily, help each other outsmart traditional and platform managers and regulators, and as we've seen, come to the table with already sharp class analysis. I want to suggest that tactics like these might be a better fit for the contemporary economy than those favored by a labor left that in some ways is hoping for aspects of Fordism's return, or one that wants workers that fit neatly into the class categories Fordism made possible. So because porn work grinds, but straight work does too, and because your best strategy for mitigating its harms is to avoid worker status as much as possible, porn workers make non-earnest demands of the state. They have good reasons to distrust the state. One, because the state has historically treated sex workers as threats to be controlled rather than workers deserving of labor rights. So this isn't a libertarian conceit. But also, they know that it's state policy that creates their vulnerabilities as gig workers in the first place, through employment law that enables contractor misclassification. Porn workers' demands for redress then are different from those many trade unions and left scholars of gig work would prescribe, where the focus is on efforts to ensure that gig workers get recognized as employees. This is because, again, most porn workers don't want to be workers. So, for example, the fight against policies such as California's Prop 22, which classified app-based delivery drivers as independent contractors, looks different in this context. Most porn workers don't want recognition as employees. Instead, their demands center on ways to untether rights and protections from worker status. Maybe the state should pay, was performer Tara Holiday's prescription for getting around the impossible legal hurdles of establishing a responsible employer in the fissured workplace. So with a long history of navigating the double bind of state surveillance and state neglect, porn workers are experts at imagining what security without control might look like. They're also skilled at building community in ways that keep each other safe in the meantime. I want to close where I began, returning to the question of what we mean when we call porn work and what kinds of politics might emerge from that. There's part of the work aspect that's distasteful to me, Habib told me. I don't like the idea of jobs. The most obscene thing is working for a living. he went on, I'm tired of hearing people, especially feminists, saying it's just a job. And I know we're not supposed to say that because we're at this moment when we're trying to prove to people that this is a job. But let's take one step beyond that and say, okay, fuck jobs. I'm excited to hear from you all about the places we might take this invitation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's give her, Dr. Berg a round of applause, be that unmute and you can clap or use the emojis, whatever you prefer, however you want to do it. Thank you so much. I'm sure everyone enjoyed that as much as I did. And I think we have numbers to where we can go ahead and take questions directly. So you don't need to post your questions into the chat. So if you want to raise your hand, use the hand raising function. And if folks want to help me keep an eye out for that and you want to ask your question directly to Heather, then let's work with that, shall we?
Should I call on folks or are you going to?
I see one person. Oh, I see a couple hand raised. So we'll start out with Veronica.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Heather, what a wonderful presentation. And I have to add that you're such a wonderful presenter. I could listen to you, I feel like on audio.
Oh, thank you so much. My computer just ate my slides just moments before we started. So I'm glad it was all right.
No, so wonderful. I really appreciated just sort of the way you presented really allowed for the ideas to sink in. So thank you for that. I was really struck, especially towards the end of your presentation, by commonalities in the experience of undocumented workers. Mm-hmm. So the idea of state surveillance and yet state neglect, the idea of course, mutual aid and mutual networks and the dependency on that.
Yeah.
The importance of entrepreneurship as a way to kind of evade labor exploitation. So help me draw those links. It's really exciting to sort of think about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a great question. I think there's so many links there historically as well as in the present moment, just in the most kind of basic empirical sense that undocumented workers have often sought out sex work as a way to make a living outside, but of course also then encountering some of the worst forms of state violence. So that's I think part of this story. But some sex worker activists, and I think again these are the folks that I'm most interested in being in conversation with, folks who aren't making an earnest appeal for decriminalization, for example, in such a way that it would make us legible exactly to an employment law apparatus, but saying that sex workers are always undocumented in some ways. And this is not to collapse the experience of folks with papers from those who don't have them, but to say that there's this kind of built-in solidarity among these communities, and not just because there's so much overlap. So I think that those are a couple of the things that I would say there. But I think the other thing that you'll find again is in both communities, and again I'm saying both while acknowledging that these aren't separate, but is this non-earnest appeal to the state, and so that you would have folks who are undocumented in the sense of not having papers, and folks who are undocumented in the sense of doing labors that can never really be made intelligible by the state. And both might make appeals for labor rights while also living and working and crossing borders in ways that deny the legitimacy of the state, like at a base level. And I think both of those things together are so exhilarating, this way that sex workers and undocumented workers can comfortably speak out of both sides of their mouth in that way, and make appeals to the state without granting it legitimacy. So I don't know if that answers your question. Well, thanks so much.
We can now turn to Eileen
Nelson. We've got two Eileens.
Yeah,
Eileen Boris had her hand up.
Okay.
No, I didn't. Nelson has it.
Mine is a very, very simple question. Nothing theoretical at all. You mentioned platform capitalism. Are you talking, is the venue you're talking about people doing this porn work on the web, is that is that almost entirely what you're talking about? I mean, given the contemporary technological world, is that what you're talking about? I mean, that's where it is, right?
Yeah, I mean, my book became anachronistic almost the moment that it went to press. So, and that is, so I'm going to pretend that makes it a history of the present. That's what y'all would call it, right? Thinking about, I think it's really telling a story of exactly this crisis moment when porn is moving from the studio to the platform. And so I think of the moment in history that I'm marking is these crisis points where, yes, both the advances of platform capitalism, but also the hacks and workarounds that workers had been experimenting with for years come together to, in some ways, make the studio more and more obsolete and make managers more and more obsolete. So in the book itself, I spend a lot of time on the traditional set, and then we see that fall away towards the end. And I frame that in an autonomous sense as the result of bottom-up struggle rather than, OnlyFans CEO figuring out new and different ways to exploit people.
I think our next question comes from Adrienne Petty.
I took my hand down because I think you clarified what my question was, which was a very simple kind of factual question about how you're defining porn work and porn workers. Who are they and what do they do? Is there any kind of, I'll just ask it anyway, sure. And forgive my ignorance, but is there crossover? Well, let me put it this way. I know that there's some crossover with people who are perform in film, but also perform as strippers, for instance. And if you spoke with people where where they have a foot in both of those worlds, do they see differences between those two tasks? Like, is one work and not, or do they just not see any kind of work? I don't know. I guess you get my question. I'm trying to make sense of all of this because I'm really intrigued by this question of whether this is work and their identity as this not being work. I think this is fascinating. And thank you so much for your presentation. I agree with Vero, where I was lulled into like, oh my gosh, she's such a great, great presenter. And I really like hung on every word, where sometimes you kind of your mind drifts like, oh my gosh, but I was right there with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. That's really kind. And thank you for this question. I think it's a huge part of the story, and I'm so grateful to you for bringing me there. So in sex worker communities more broadly, and here too, most people don't just do one thing. And so the vast majority of the workers in this story have multiple hustles, often in sex work, because for the reasons I laid out, I figured out that it's bad math to do straight jobs, although some people use porn work and other sex work hustles to supplement straight jobs. Not least being a graduate student is a popular one. But yeah, so a lot of people do scene work as an advertisement for their other sex work hustles, not least dancing, as you mentioned. And I'll also get to the question of whether the analysis of whether it counts as work shifts there. But one thing I do want to say is that when folks talk about using a scene as advertisement for their other hustles, I do think that creates some tensions, it certainly did for me, around how to talk about labor exploitation at the point of the scene. Because if there's so much going on there where producers and directors, or in the case of platform work, the platform is seeing the scene as an opportunity for exploitation, and the wage is less than the scene rate or the cut. But when workers aren't understanding the scene as a job at all, but as a way to either resist work, or in this case, advertise their other work, then they see the scene as a creative way to get producers to pay for their ad copy, really. And this creates whole new categories, I think, for labor studies that are really unruly, or I found them so. In terms of this question of whether folks see different hustles as more or less work-like, I think sometimes, a lot of people do talk about porn work as more playful and pleasureful than forms of sex work in which they have to deal with civilians or non-sex workers. So porn work is often grinding and boring, but people are also often having sex with their friends and their comrades in this way. And there's a lot of conviviality there that you don't find dealing with clients at a strip club, and certainly not with clients in-person sex work, such as escorting. And so the kind of tediums of dealing with mostly straight men clients outside the porn set can make that feel more work-like. On the other hand, escorts, especially because they work totally independently, have a lot more autonomy than many porn workers who work under a platform, under terms of service agreements, or under a director. So the kinds of autonomy that you would have to set the terms for health practices, the length of a date, things like that. In that way, then escorting can feel less managed. So that hinges, or that shapes some of how people describe this. But I also just want to say, in terms of this thread you're pulling out of whether folks identify this as work in the first place, that it would really would shift sometimes for people within the space of a day, and also depending on who you're talking to. So you'll hear dancers might talk to each other about hustles as something non-work like, but then at the point of policy advocacy, talk about this as a kind of job in the most legible terms. And so I'm not arguing that except for Connor, who really is going from an anti-work position in this pretty strict sense, I think for most people, it shifts over the course of a workday of the career and then the audience. Thanks so much for that question.
I just want to take a moment to draw everyone's attention to the links for the Labor and Working Class History Association in the chat. If you're not already a member, please consider joining. You can click on that link. And also I've posted links to the upcoming book talks, so you can register and come and see. We've got a great lineup for the rest of the spring and into the summer. Do other folks have some more questions here? Oh, I see our other Eileen Boris.
Yeah. Well, of course, I think this is wonderful. I wanted to ask you to explore more that tension between the discourse of work as the language of organizing or of categorization, and that is done to the civilian world, as you would put it, versus the self-perceptions of the job. And is another imaginary for collective action, for better conditions, or better pay, or more freedom. What can we learn from the sex workers or the people you spoke to?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I guess maybe people don't know why you're saying, of course. You thought it was Eileen and Lila were my graduate mentors. So that's, if you're wondering why the of course, that's why. The Eileen who just spoke, not the Nelson Eileen. Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I think in terms of what can be learned from this stance, such as it is a unified stance in the first place, I think. Well, now I feel I'm saying things that you already know that I think, but this is, I suppose, for the, but I think this kind of demand for the opposite of an honest day's wage for an honest day's work is really provocative in this context. There are some porn workers, certainly specifically in the feminist and queer porn genres, who make claims for legibility and particularly legibility to the state because of through recourse to the social value of their jobs. But for the most part, the argument is that as people who are trying to survive, their claims for freedom, as you say, are based on that alone and not the dignity of work and not what it means for clients, for consumers, for secondary consumers. And for me, that's one of the most generative pieces of this politic. I think a lot about what that might look like for various workers who are organizing against pandemic conditions right now. And some of the ways that teachers, for example, are navigating the double bind set up by the argument that our working conditions or students' learning conditions, it becomes really hard to make a claim against work in an atmosphere in which that might negatively impact students, although that's debatable. But I think there's just so much room to maneuver in sex worker strategies to avoid those claims altogether and to make claims as sex workers for sex workers. So I think that that's the primary thing that I would say.
All right, next we have Lila.
Hi, Heather. I think what was just so wonderful about that is how you captured the whole book in under 30 minutes and all the complexities, which is pretty amazing. And, you know, what I love about this is just how everything is a contradiction of everything. So it's work and it's not work, and it's good work and it's not good work. And it's, I mean, just it just really captures your big point. But the only question I really have, because I've read so much of this, is that you mentioned this question that at the beginning of your talk, well, I forgot what you called it, the weirdest, strangest question. So I think you should share it with everybody.
Okay, and you do know the answer to this one too.
I do.
So yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you, Lila. And yeah, I think this is one of the very convenient things about dialectics, is that it allows one to avoid having to actually make an argument. I just say everything's a contradiction, and we all go home. But yes, my favorite answer to what's the strangest or funniest question you've gotten in response to your work came from LAWCHA. I had given a paper on occupational health and told a story of a worker who had broken his penis during a scene, having injected a lot of Caverject, which is an injectable version of Viagra, basically. And he was tasked with paying $100,000 for surgery himself, and had no workers' comp. And in our conversation, I had said, could you have filed for workers' compensation? This is literally at work injury, it was on screen. And he explained that this would have blacklisted him. So that was the nature of my paper. And afterwards, a senior historian who I admire a lot came up to me and very nervously asked how he could avoid the same fate of breaking his penis. This was not in the open Q&A, but just afterwards. And so we talked about the particularities of reverse cowgirl and Caverject use. But that is my favorite answer to that question. So thanks, Lila. I'll never tell who it is. I don't know if they're here now, but your secret's safe with me.
All right. Well, our next question comes from Hannah.
So it's quite an active follow, I guess. Hi, Hannah.
Hi. I just wanted to give you a moment this was really fascinating and not my area of study at all. So I learned a lot and had a lot of questions. And I think something it sounds like you teased out was thinking about people who work in porn as sort of like a canary in the coal mine for like capitalism. And I was hoping to just hear you talk more about that, about why you think that might be, about if that is how you're thinking about it, just to give you some space to kind of tease out those connections a little bit more.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for this.
Yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, I do think, and this is something that sex workers more broadly talk about, is the ways that they really do experience, particularly policy, as canaries in the coal mine. And so I think the most obvious piece of that is in terms of surveillance politics, where sex workers are the first to warn of what is coming in terms of internet surveillance in particular, but more broadly historically in terms of the ways that vice policing has given the state more access to our everyday lives. Sex workers are often the first to experience this, and the first to say, we will not be the last. And civilians rarely believe them, and then some years might feel the sting. So I think that that's the most obvious piece of this. But I do argue in the book more broadly that porn workers can lay claim to being sort of canaries in the coal mine for gigification more broadly. And so it's just really striking in this context that the kinds of conditions that labor scholars are at this moment and for the last 10 years or so, marking and mourning as a kind of new crisis, a crisis of the gigification. Sex workers have always been gig working. And so what that means is not so much a warning of the horrors to come, but to say that sex workers have already developed a lot of analysis and skills for surviving gig economies and keeping each other alive outside of state support. And so the argument in terms of saying the ways that this kind of anticipates historical shifts that might come for straight workers later is to say that sex workers have already developed these skills, and that those who are mourning this crisis in the moment might turn to their expertise. And I think the other piece of that is just to say that at the level of the marketization of intimacy, and the sense that like personal life is newly being brought to the market. This is obviously something sex workers have a lot of historical memory for. So those are some of the ways that I see that operating. But I think at the level of law, the major thing is to like pay attention when sex workers say the state is worming its way in. And I think we can see what that looks like in all sorts of areas. Thanks for your question.
That was all the questions that we had on the docket. So
no one wants to argue with me about Prop 22. I thought that would be the one for this crap.
Okay, we have a challenge that's been issued. Would like to argue?
Can I ask another simple question?
Yes. See, I thought it might be you, but
I haven't read your book. Give me a little sociological portrait here. I mean, I haven't read your book. I guess it's in there, but tell me what age, race, who you're talking about,
Yeah. So interviewees ranged from 18 to, I think the oldest at the time of our interview was 76. And folks who had worked in the industry from the so-called golden era of the 1970s till today. Some folks who had worked over the course of decades, but the majority who were current workers at the time of our conversations, and who'd been in the industry between a year and 5 years. In terms of other, in terms of like industry sectors, I talked to folks without getting too deep in the weeds of how the genres are defined, folks in straight mainstream, in gay mainstream, in feminist and queer films, which are otherwise billed as like ethical production, and like as we were talking about in relation to Adrienne's question, a lot of people do work in multiple genres, and then folks who identify racially across the spectrum, and many of whom too identify racially in ways that are different when they're performing than they do in their everyday lives. And likewise, in terms of sexual orientation and gender identification. So that's the sociological portrait.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
There's actually a really Catherine Pierpont.
Oh, yeah.
You put in a fantastic comment in the chat, and I'm wondering whether you'd like to elaborate on that. Sorry to put you on the spot.
That'd be great.
Hi, yeah. So my comment in the chat, because I don't really have a fully formed question, but I study sex work pre-capitalism, and I rightfully get a lot of pushback on using the term sex work, but I'm frankly not comfortable with, for the sake of deferring to anachronism, saying prostitution. So as I was listening to your talk and thinking about what this sort of push and pull of anti-work approach to porn work means, the idea that it is work when we need it to be work in order to sort of exist in a system that places value on that specific capitalistic idea, but that we don't buy into the sort of the mess of capitalism that comes with that, is really interesting, because I've been trying to think a lot about what it means to do sex work before capitalism, and what it means to engage in commercial sex before capitalism. And interestingly, what you were just saying about the canaries in the coal mine is, it's also not an invention of modernity, because sort of when I study in the 12th century, it's sort of tacitly accepted, and then it's criminalized, or well, then it's municipalized briefly, which it turns out doesn't go well. So for proponents of legalization, we have some precedent. It's not great. And then sort of it's criminalized, and then as we move to the early modern period, sort of all of the moral strictures get tighter, you know. So to your point, exactly what you're saying, that there is a lot of there's a lot of omens and sort of bits of what's to come, in the sense that sex becomes a focal point for cracking down on particular vice, and sex workers are the first ones to feel it. And there's also like fascinating and very well documented support that sort of control of sex work is actually a mechanism of control of usually women's sexuality. So like I said, I do not have a fully formed question of any sort, but I thought it was for me sitting here, it was really fruitful talk to listen to sort of this late capitalism move to this gig economy, and how do we think about work that is fundamentally trying not to be work. Because there's pre-capitalism versions of sex work as well that also require this same thought experiment. So I really appreciated your talk. It was great.
Thank you so much for your comments. Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to hear more on why you're getting pushback for using sex work. I think, you know, my hunch there is that so much of that pushback boils down to readers' like continued interest in what I call like a client's eye view. So like needing to understand the work from the perspective of consumers and of states. And like there's so much more to say about this. But I would guess that like the workers, hustlers, what have you in your story are also seeing what they do on different terms than the people consuming do. So I think you can keep saying. But yeah, I mean, the other piece that I think is so fascinating about the period that you study is the way that that sex exchange, we'll use that for now, is also makes the ruling class so uncomfortable for the way that it brings people into class conflict in this really intimate way. And so that's just one thing that I think is really, I love that sense of anxiety that people get at that moment. Thank you.
And it looks like we have one last question from somebody who might have some microphone issues. It's in the chat. I can read it.
Cool. And then we've got one from Mark too.
Okay. It says, I've been thinking a lot about how sex workers expertly hack the internet, particularly how they challenge the censorship that they have to navigate. Can you please say more about their hacking strategies and what we might learn from their practices? How to protect our privacy, challenge censorship, etc.
Yeah, thanks so much for your question, Danielle. I think one of the things that's so tricky about information sharing, but certainly also producing scholarship around hacks is the kind of perennial question of how to write about workplace sabotage, which is like, how much do you want to reveal tactics? And I think that sex workers are always navigating this tension where there are more workers than there are regulators, certainly. And so in that case, the kind of the benefits of sharing information about what those hacks would be specifically might outweigh the risks. But it's also something I think about a lot, like how much to even say. And we're not in mixed company here. I don't think we've got any running dogs in the room, but I do think it's tricky. So that's part of why I'm dancing around your question about what specifically those hacks look like. But I will say that that sex workers' understanding of how code works, understandings of how algorithmic management operates are really, really sophisticated. And the ways that sex workers share information with each other around how to outsmart the algorithm, I think there's so much to say there. Just reading. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, Haley can pop in if you're comfortable, but in terms of protecting oneself online, I can, pass this over to Haley, but to close out, Danielle, I think in terms of the hacks, figuring out exactly how the algorithm is working at any moment, figuring out how to circumvent that, then of course the game of whack-a-mole continues, and the algorithm adjusts. But I think it's really important to recognize, I think from the standpoint of how we tell this labor history, that these forms of algorithmic and surveillance control follow workers' interventions rather than anticipate them. But yeah, Haley, did you want to pop in?
Hello.
Hi.
So I'm an undergrad student. I'm also, like I said, a sex worker, and my undergrad research focuses on sex work. But I noticed that the question was kind of about like online privacy and stuff like that. So just like when you go in a strip club and like a dancer has a stage name, a lot of us who work online have stage names. Recently we've kind of at like a collectively started doing like alternative things to protect ourselves, like simply buying completely new cell phones and new computers, because we are living in an era where being on social media and being out about being a sex worker can get you banned pretty quickly. There's also like I'm also a stripper, and a lot of the girls at the clubs that I dance with have like backup accounts in the event that they do get banned. Some of them, if they don't have an extra cell phone, they use like a text-free app for like their number so that they don't have to give their actual personal phone number out. I have escort friends who actually have websites and they actually screen their clients, and they do like background checks, and they'll like find their LinkedIn accounts and make sure that like that they are who they say they are, basically. But it's really just like living a second life, honestly. It's almost like witness protection, but like for sex work. So that's like the gist of it.
Cool. Thank you so much. It's really useful. Thank you. Mark?
My question is sort of elusive in my brain, but you've given me a lot to think about as you've sort of discussing the rise of platform capitalism and the gig economy. And I'm wondering if you find any value in some of the current work that's being done in social reproduction theory, right? If we go to wages for housework, right, sex is social reproduction, right? And yet it seems like sex work is the commodification of social reproduction if we follow that along the lines. And
Yeah.
Do you see that the gig economy has sort of a special niche in this commodification of social reproduction, right? DoorDash, TaskRabbit, you know, all of these things that are then commodifying that sort of reproduction of daily life. And that tension to me, can you explore sort of that tension? Because that's a difficult area to organize. It's a difficult area to, I was a contingent worker until graduate school, right? And so no union was interested in sort of what I didn't fit an appropriate category, right? It seems, I'm sorry, I went on, you know, does that sort of make sense of where I'm asking? Does the social reproduction does social reproduction theory help your work? And do you think that the gig economy and platform economy has sort of a special relationship with the new economy of commodifying social reproduction? There, I think I actually got it coherent.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I think to the first piece of your question, I think social reproduction theory, it offers my work a lot. I'm thinking about particularly what, in more broadly, like beyond this book, but as I'm thinking about the politics of anti-sex work prohibition, what exactly is so incendiary for the capitalist state about paid sex? And so, you know, we know that the state has a lot at stake in ensuring that most sex is free. And I think that sex work, that social reproduction theory has a lot to help us understand why that is, and why the ruling class needs sex to be unpaid. So that's what I'd say to the first piece. I think to your question about the app-based gig economy, I think you know, without trivializing the specificity of this moment in platform capitalism, I think I'd err on the side of saying that it's not that new forms of everyday life are being commodified, that they were already always on the market, and that platformization makes that visible in new ways, which I do think is something to organize around. But the thing that worries me as a matter of tactics is the sense that I think some of us on the labor left are mourning that the appification, the visibility of commodification rather than its longue durée. And that makes me think that then the cure will be shorter lived and nostalgic, and not get us to a more expansive horizon. So that's my concern as we're thinking around how to organize around that. Does that answer your question? Cool. Thank you so much. Just catching up in the chat, but I think
I think we are at the end of our questions, and I just want to once again go ahead and thank you and thank everybody for attending. It's been a great talk, and the questions were awesome, and yeah, it's been good. This has been recorded, and I will check with some folks to make sure that the recording is postable. And
can you redact the broken penis story?
I cannot. Well, I don't personally have the editing capability to do that.
Okay, I'm just
someone else
kidding.
does. We can.
No. I think that stays. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate your questions, everyone.
Okay.